material, the data that is out there, and then the journalism is the crafting of that into a narrative. And this is why we talk about journalists who are getting and telling a story as opposed to news just happening. And that more passive version of, well, I'm just reporting the news is still reflected actually in the BBC, who actually calls their newscasters news readers. So you're simply the vessel for disseminating some kind of grand objective truth, and then audiences converge on the same few sources to get that truth. It's a lot more complex now. It's a lot more complicated territory because really we've come to realize that any sort of factual data is always enmeshed in various kinds of interpretive contexts. And so you can have the same news, but that's not necessarily going to generate the same story for journalists. So that's kind of my take on it. Of course, the problem now is a lot of people conflate the idea of a story as narrative with a story as a lie. Like, oh, you're telling me a story, why don't you tell me the truth? Mm-hmm. And the assumption is, well, if we no longer have that absolute objective factual knowledge, then all we have is just a jumble of opinions that are indistinguishable, and you have yours and you have mine, and now there's just no truth at all, and it's just whatever I say is true, and then everything I don't like or that possibly challenges my belief system, I can simply dismissively call something like fake news or bias. Mm-hmm. But of course, just because you have a point of view doesn't necessarily mean you're biased, and a lot of times that escapes attention. That points of view are not simply random. Some are better supported than others.
Well, that kind of gets to a question that I have later, and I have some questions prepared for you today, but of course I like to kind of go off what you're saying too. And I've been studying this a while, and folks out there who are on shows that are a point of view or opinion, they often call this bias and or reporter bias, partisan bias. And my question was, should a person who is in a position of power, let's say they are the host of a news show and or any show on a quote-unquote news channel, should they announce their bias? Should they announce their point, whether it's point of view, this is just my point of view, this is my opinion, or this is, my political bias is Republican, it's Democrat, it's independent, per se, or libertarian?
Well, you can announce it, but the question becomes, to what extent is that salient to what's being discussed, right? I mean, I could say, for example, that like I'm a member of the Green Party or the Communist Party or whatever, but to what extent does that actually have bearing on what is being discussed? And the other thing too is we can talk about opinion-based journalism and all of that. I would like us to get back to the idea that you never hear discussed really, is that when you are talking about journalism, yes, you're telling a story, but at the same time you're making an argument. And arguments can be evaluated on the basis of their quality. Maybe it's just, the old debate coach coming out in me and the fact that I deal with argumentation, analysis and things like that. But when you look at it that way, the whole idea here is that you can have high quality material from a source that has a particular point of view that doesn't necessarily make it biased. I mean, the definition of bias is sticking to a point of view despite rational opposition. And when you move into dogmatism, that's when you get into bias. And so it's a matter of degree. So, I mean, I think there are
and dogmatism being pushing that point of view.
Actually, I look at kind of from the other side of things. It's not so much being an aggressive advocate for a point of view. I don't think there's any real problem with that. I think where it does become a problem is that it's the other way around, where it's not so much pushing, but not being willing to listen to the other side, not being able to or willing to engage any sort of disconfirming evidence, any forms of oppositional views, rejecting any challenge just immediately without assessing it. And that's where things become problematic. And that's the difference between someone who is basically kind of a hack or a pundit or whatever, who's just trying to be polemical, and someone who is seriously trying to engage with issues and be a journalist in the highest sense.
And so, what is a journalist in this highest sense, and what standards of integrity does a person who is both editing their work for presentation? You say, you're reading the news, and I imagine the ticker tape that used to be on the AP News, coming across, and we now see it on the bottom of our screen quite often, little snips of statements of
Right.
news and or their reports, and I would think that journalism is something that must be verified, that the statement can't be just gossip that's been heard, but it must be verified by a number of sources.
Well, that's exactly right. And as a matter of fact, if you're talking about standards for journalism, to me, they're almost identical to the standards for good argumentation. What are the elements of a good argument? So basically, one of the first obligations you have is to be a critical thinker. And that applies not only to opposing views, but to your own. Constantly subject claims to scrutiny. Evaluate the quality of sources. Actually, I think one thing that gets in the way of a lot of this is exactly what you're talking about, the little news crawls or attempting to communicate meaningful messages in 140 characters, and on social media. And I feel for people who are trying to meet some sort of ethical standards in this arena, because they're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, there's the very traditional journalistic ideal of, journalistic objectivity. But that doesn't necessarily mean the idea that, all sides are equal and we have to air them all. I mean, are we obligated, for example, when I'm giving a talk on Holocaust studies, to have equal time to a Holocaust denier? Do we need to have someone who is a member of the Flat Earth Society to also address people who are hearing from a scientist about geography? These sorts of things.
It seems to me it would depend upon the context in which it was, what was the objective of the story.
Right, but at the same time, the idea is that not all sides or opinions are created equal. Just because something is a side doesn't necessarily mean it has merit. So that's the traditional notion of journalistic objectivity, but that's really hard to reconcile with the real push of most media, aside from something like public broadcasting, and that is the profit motive, and that is you've got to gain and keep and expand your audience. This personally, I believe, is one of the fundamental lapses in media coverage in the 2016 election. Specifically regarding Donald Trump as a candidate. He did get a lot of coverage, but the coverage was a mode of coverage that was essentially, isn't it exciting and interesting to have this celebrity personality, rather than the type of scrutinizing you would have from a diligent journalist.
Yes, and going back to the original, how many sources would it take for a story and or news to uphold the standard of journalism?
Well, obviously that varies with the individual circumstance, but the whole thing here is that if you're really doing this right, the idea is you never rest easy saying, now I have the definitive story.
Okay.
You're always searching for not just more confirmation, because that's confirmation bias, and you're just looking for stuff that you like, but you're always subjecting your story to continuous testing. It's just like science.
And it seems like to verify it more than once.
Actually, I would say
that would be my assumption as a professor, but
I'd turn that upside down a little bit, and I'd say not so much just to verify it more than once, but to constantly subject it to the challenge of falsifiability. That you're constantly saying, okay, where would I look for evidence that would disconfirm this? And you're continually testing the merits of your claims, which also means that you're always willing to admit you might have been wrong, or you might need to modify your position.
That's always been a good measure for me. If something stands the harsh review from many, many sides, it seems to be a stronger, more valid statement to me. If it can withstand the white hot light of spotlight, it can endure for me as something as valid or true. So it would seem that that would be a part of this. And I think going forward as a country, we must start to disseminate these things because of the power of something coming up that I want you to talk about, that you have quite a bit of expertise in, which is propaganda. Let's talk about what is propaganda and why is this such a powerful force, especially right now, for us to understand.
Well, at 2 o'clock tomorrow, there's going to be new insight on that because that's when my propaganda class meets. And so my
New
students
insight
can
from
answer
you
that.
to your
That was on
students.
quiz 1, actually.
But to those of us who are at this moment your students, tell us about that.
That's kind of tricky. Propaganda is largely a matter of degree. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, you've crossed this line in the sand and now you have propaganda. Unfortunately, a lot of people use propaganda as essentially just kind of an insult for anything that they don't like. So if there's a news story that, for example, challenges some sort of dogmatically held political belief, you can just not have to engage it by saying, oh, that's mere propaganda. But the hallmark of propaganda is basically that it is focused on manipulation of audiences. And
For a negative end. Or
well,
one's own
not
personal
necessarily.
selfish ends.
Not necessarily.
Or political ends.
Because we also have
Okay.
ad campaigns, such as pro-social ad campaigns.
Okay, I'm gonna let you define. Sorry.
Anti-drugs,
Okay.
right? Or anti-smoking campaigns.
And you would call that a propaganda?
Well, they clearly have a pro-social message, and but
Okay.
the whole idea is that there is a definite particular interest that is seeking to control information in certain ways to influence the audience's behavior.
Now, could we bend that into controlling it to placate or cater to an audience for money?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And people have to
Okay.
bear in mind the actual term propaganda originates in the Catholic Church for the order of the propagation of the faith. And so the very origin of the term certainly didn't have negative connotations, and in fact only after about World War II did you find governments stop labeling parts of their governmental apparatus the propaganda ministry. Goebbels kind of made that a lot less popular, but it's not necessarily a mark of shame, but it's a mark of degree.
Well, that's certainly an education for me because
Yeah.
when I think of propaganda, I think of something negative
Sure.
as something that's created to manipulate, as you say, a collective group of those listening or reading or receiving the communication, try to manipulate them to one particular perspective.
Well, and sometimes though, remember, you have to when people are making decisions and doing things that are not based on argumentation, that are not based on rational considerations. Sometimes the only resort is to move towards something that is directly going to counteract their motives. A good case is smoking, right? One of the big influences in getting people to smoke at an early age is peer pressure. Well, obviously nobody who smokes who is in any degree rational is sitting down there looking at a balance sheet saying, when push comes to shove, weighing the advantages and disadvantages, I'm much better off smoking than not smoking, right? All of the costs, both economically, health risks, all of this. And so one of the big things is peer pressure, right? So the question is, how do you dislodge that sense that smoking is cool and all of that? Well, argumentation, rationally based argumentation that is, isn't going to do it. So what you do is you resort to a message that activates the same kinds of behavioral drivers. And that is, and you see this a little bit finally in the anti-smoking ads.
I was just thinking,
yeah.
is that what that's propaganda?
Well,
that we
a lot of
see
it
those
now
ads?
is like,
Okay.
the people who don't smoke are the cool ones, and smoking stigmatizes you, and look, you have to go outside, and nobody wants to be around you, and you smell bad, and all of that sort of thing. And so I think we have to recognize that propaganda describes a set of tools. And just like any tool in a tool chest, a hammer can be used to build a home for someone who's homeless, or it can be used as a murder weapon. it depends on the person who's wielding it.
Excellent point. So it's honestly it's a deeper look at that term and concept than even I was looking at. I was looking at it as an influencer, which it is, but it can be positive in a way. And I think of it as a negative whenever I think of manipulation, I think of it as the objective being not holistically good. Mm-hmm. In other words, if it's a television station with a collection of letters, news, using a particular type of influence or messaging to placate to an audience in order to get ratings and get money and advertisers, to me that feels a little bit propaganda-ish.
Well, sure, absolutely. And I think the big difference is that the more you move toward propaganda, and I actually in my class have this little diagram that I've borrowed from various sources where it's kind of a continuum, where on one side you kind of have this direct dissemination of factual knowledge, something like the information in your GPS system, okay? But then you move toward propaganda, and then ultimately there are things much more extreme than propaganda, such as extreme mind control, where you're literally like programming people's brains.
Could we say that that is happening with television commercials and just the way that things are creatively presented on, because television is such a powerful medium of influence?
That's a very good place to look, because I think one of the hallmarks of the tools that are in that tool chest called propaganda is that what distinguishes this from what we would consider more benign forms of influence, such as persuasion, is that in propaganda you have a much heavier dependence on emotion-based motivators.
And you have a clear specific objective.
Right, right. It's sort of like, look, I know where I want you to go, and by golly, I'm going to steer you in that direction.
And I'm going to ask questions that a lot of times I teach my students about leading questions and the way we influence. Well, to me, this is such a very pervasively important thing to understand when we're trying to understand things like fake news. And when it was first started to be, I started going, what is that? When I would go on to my, childhood friends' Facebook. So I basically use Facebook for seeing some of my childhood friends that I love dearly and what they're doing, and I would see all these ads come up, and I would go, wait a minute, what is this picture? What is this? Is this what is this? And then it becomes clear that I forget exactly what time frame in December and January that some officials had been presenting pictures of one political candidate and presenting gossip as news and putting it together, and so we have fake news. And now our president is using the term fake news, and I want you to talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to something that is not just getting important. I think you're going to see this becoming more and more important. First of all, there are two different things going on there. When somebody uses fake news, as the president has tended to use it, basically that's simply a label that is assigned to disqualify something from engagement. It's also very self-serving, because if you simply dismiss something as not worthy of attention, it means you don't have to do any research on it, you don't have to formulate any counter-arguments, and you bear no responsibility for actually making any sort of nuanced assessment of the source.
So you want to categorically dismiss it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's basically sending whatever that source is out to quarantine, and I don't want to have to engage it. And what's interesting is it says a whole lot more about the person who's doing the labeling of the fake news, right, than it does about the news source itself.
It can. It can in this case, and I seek to understand his perspective, because I teach my students all the time, in order to really understand conflicts like the media, we need to look at both sides. What's really driving the emotion behind the side that we might think is right or wrong? What's behind it? How can we understand what's going on with that? And so I try and understand what Mr. Trump is saying, and I think, okay, he's feeling like his perspective is not getting communicated at all. He's overwhelmingly allowing the negative critique of him when he hears that coming across the airwaves, whether it's in newsprint or actually on radio or television, he is just hearing the negative. He's not hearing the good things of what he feels he is doing coming out, and he's just feeling like he's not getting heard. And I can have some. I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand his perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me mention.
Not that I'm not trying to say I'm backing it. I'm definitely not doing that. I do want like I'm always teaching my students, the way we seek peace and find understanding and get beyond things and learn from them is try to understand the other side.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the classic peace and conflict approach. Of
It
course,
is.
Right? Because unless you can do that, then you're
stay stuck.
Constantly in an impasse. Absolutely. And in fact, the fact that there's a need to do that keeps people like us in business.
Exactly.
Because we want people to engage with each other in more direct ways. Well, a couple of things. First of all, the original fake news idea actually was just a classic kind of propaganda tactic known as gray propaganda or dark propaganda. And that is where you have a message that appears to say one thing or be from one particular source, and then upon further investigation it turns out, no, it's actually impersonating that source, or it's a misleading headline. And your examples from Facebook and all that are classic, because it's, clickbait by definition is exactly that. Something, an image or text or a combination thereof, is enticing you to click on it, maybe to generate ad revenues for some source or something like that.
Or influence political opinion.
Yeah, but it really doesn't have the substance you thought it would.
Yes.
On the other hand, I would say that, you're talking about trying to understand, the perspective of, say, Trump's usage of the fake news accusation, really, because it's not it's an accusation. I think it becomes understandable if you can approach it in a somewhat different way. I had mentioned earlier about journalism and storytelling and all of that. One of the things that Donald Trump has been able to do from the very beginning is he has an incredibly consistent narrative. And a lot of people kind of missed this about that "Make America Great Again" narrative. They were focusing on, it's a regressive narrative and all of that. But there's a very powerful piece of that he's still activating. It's a narrative of victimage. And the idea is that he, and by extension, his political supporters, and even people who are on the fence, who just kind of feel like, gosh, I'm not benefiting from the recovery, I'm not enjoying the fruits of the improved economy or what have you, feel, all right, the world is kind of against me. It's also a very attractive position to be in, because we love an underdog. Okay? As a matter of fact, there's even a cartoon superhero I used to watch as a kid, Underdog.
I remember the Underdog.
The voice was Wally Cox, as a matter of fact.
Really?
And,
I did not know that.
He's spinning that. Now, of course, where things get quite problematic is the other half of that is, all right, if you're a victim, then how are you going to relieve that victimage, right? And there are basically two ways, and this is drawing from classic Kenneth Burke types of ideas, the literary and communication critic. There are basically two ways you can deal with the victimage. You can say, well, I am going to become more self-reflective and look for the problem inside myself. And of course, the classic image of that is the monastic self-deprivation of I'm going to reflect, I'm going to even physically abuse myself, whatever it takes to just really endure and face my own demons. Okay.
No one does that. They want someone else to stand up and slay that dragon, and that's, I think, what you're saying. Is Trump put himself as that dragon slayer.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Because what happens then is, remember, but see, the dragon slayer is one step later, right? Because where we're still at the step is, well, what's causing the victimage, right? Well, one is the cause lies within, right? And I've got to, have that hard road.
But do
you
you really think people get to that? Most folks, I mean, even.
Well, I mean, this is the whole purpose of things such as psychotherapy, for example.
Well, it is,
right?
it is, and so many people think, oh, that means that's for crazy people. But those of us who, I think we all have moments of deep reflection. But I'm not sure that we're all able to look at ourselves and own our own faults and things.
No.
But
I mean, this is why we actually reserve special occasions for them, like in
it's
the Jewish faith.
It's easier to blame someone else, right?
Well, like in the Jewish faith, it's like Yom Kippur, 24 hours, you do that self-reflection, okay, yeah. But there's the other half of this that that then potentially becomes really pernicious. And that is, if you're not going to internally locate the source of the victimage, then the location is external.
And that's somebody else's fault. We're going to blame them.
Exactly. And that's where you look for the scapegoat.
Right. Yeah.
And then, of course, the idea is, well, how do you rescue people from the scapegoat? Well, here comes the knight in shining armor, and I'll rescue you from the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one possibility is, well, those evil forces can't hurt you if physically they can't have access for you.
That's a really good point. But to look at the victim idea, in our field of peace and conflict studies, in another way, it is a collective group of folks that have not been heard. They have not had their perspective validated, and so there is that to be given. To have it behooves all of us to understand one another, to not judge so much, but yet open our minds and begin to understand those voices so they won't feel like victims. And the need to find a dragon slayer to go and slay dragons, because it's in education that we deliver ourselves and empower to move forward. But I want to kind of go back to this, that our media topic today. I'm going to fess up here. I tell you, I'm fighting stress every day. This whole topic has been elevated in recent weeks to places that. I'm worried. I'm not alone. I know I'm not, because I see our representatives, Republicans, Democrats, being worried about where the debate about media is going in this country. For instance, on February 24th, the White House Press Secretary, Sean Spicer, closed out the press room to New York Times. He closed it out to, I actually wrote the list down, Washington Post, CNN, BuzzFeed, News, and HuffPost, which are all liberal or Democratic leaning, and every conservative was allowed in. This is not the only time it's ever happened, but in the contentious environment that we have to deal with the reality of Sean Spicer being spoofed, and this the whole phenomenon that we are collectively in the United States experiencing, it's important that choices of behavior for leaders in his position be considered. And I think what it went on the 24th, many news organizations found out about it. They protested and walked out and refused to come, and that bothered me. Did it bother you that happened?
It did to some degree. I mean, I would like to strike an optimistic note in all this, and that is in a new media environment where there are so many alternative sources of information. And how it's so easy to circumvent information bans. That the approach of censorship. I mean, this is an old media approach, right? Restrict the flow of the broadcast going out, and by golly, you'll get to control the message. I hate to tell you, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to have unilateral control over the message. Just ask Bill Clinton with Monica Lewinsky. They tried to stifle that story, and they were scooped by, of all places, the Drudge Report undermined that. Now, that said, one of the things that this is signaling that's very disturbing is allied to things such as the refusal to actually even look at or disseminate clearly established scientific evidence and things such as that, because it's an attempt to not just undermine the flow of information, but to undermine the very things that we would use to ground rational argument.
Yes.
And so it's kind of disqualifying what would count as sources of legitimate evidence.
Yes. It is true, and
that's the scary part.
It is scary, and I know Mr. Spicer nor anyone important is likely, except a few folks here in Greensboro listening to us. But my goodness, he's cutting off his nose to spite his face. In other words, a clear, open press will give him the tools to get the information out there, let folks talk about it. That is the way forward to control the information, rather than, as you were suggesting, lock them out, only. And
sure.
And I truly, I kind of step back and I think about this. I bet it is a frightening place for many of them. They're all brand new to being in the White House, and the overwhelming majority of folks in the news press and the television press and the radio press, not all of them, but they're all going, they're really, there's a great deal of negative press out there. Let's say it that way. And so I can understand, and I believe that a term that you brought up a minute ago, confirmation bias. I believe it's not a far-reaching. This is a point of view statement. This is one I try my best when I'm teaching too to say, listen, this is where this statement's coming from. This is my point of view, and my point of view is that Mr. Trump and many of those around him really love confirmation bias news that funnels to them what they are looking for. The Fox News, the conservative newspaper readings, and maybe for a time they were as many. I know many of people that I know don't watch anything except that, or don't read anything, and don't expose themselves to anything but that, and they get that confirmation bias. Say, yes, I'm right about what I think.
Sure. Well, confirmation bias, it just proves that they're human.
It does prove, and yes, it does.
The world of confirmation bias, it's a happy place to be, because you don't have to encounter much cognitive dissonance.
That's right.
And you're constantly in this environment where everybody is reinforcing what you already believe and know.
And the same is true of the Democratic perspective.
Well, and that's the point, exactly the point I want to make. What I find though is that basically censorship is the coward's way of information management.
It is.
And that is because rather than trying to actually shut down opposing arguments by defeating the arguments in the marketplace of ideas, you simply try to cut them off from being expressed. And that's a very different thing.
I get that, and the fear of that, of course, is North Korea, China, major countries in our world who prevent anything except what they want to hear. And I'm a human being. Even though I know, I teach, I live to look at both perspectives, I have a bit of, when I'm at home, I really do try to keep my personal perspective to myself, but I love to hear what I think is right. And
Sure.
It's a challenge for me to make myself turn over and read the other newspapers, but I do. And I do challenge myself, sometimes I'm listening going, not sure about that. That seems like it's not presenting both perspectives. But I'll have to say that on both political sides, when I look at both perspectives, I feel the same way a little bit. Maybe less so on my confirmation side of the politics that I lean toward, but I do see it. I really do challenge myself, and I think maybe going forward as Americans, it's one option for us to continue to challenge ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that and you asked earlier about journalistic ethics and things like that. I think we could even extend that further, saying, hey, maybe journalists shouldn't just constantly be challenging their stories and their sources. But we as audiences of news reports, audiences of presidential addresses, audiences of White House communications, etc., need to be constantly doing the same thing. I mean, this is why we have to train people to be critical thinkers, and train people to think scientifically and to look for falsifying beliefs rather than constantly confirming them, because it isn't always comfortable. But then again, the learning process always involves pushing yourself a bit beyond your comfort zone, and that's part of the definition of learning and growing as a person.
It is, and I always teach my students, listen, if you want to make your side stronger, study the other side.
Absolutely.
It not only it makes you really holistically understand your side and their side. It as a debater, I'm sure you will know, you will find things in that side. So there is that. I hope that that message will go out there, because studying the other side does help you to kind of, because our sides are not finite. They're ever changing.
Right.
And another thing that is true too, it sounds like it's a contradictory statement, but one of the things I'll have to fess up that I'm thankful for is the media and the press questioning our White House. I am thankful for that. I'm going to have to say that because I think that is what our democratic society, as opposed to one that is, led by a dictator, that is what keeps us all a part of this democracy, that we shine a light on what should be strong enough to withstand that light.
Oh, absolutely. This is why one of the first items in the playbook of any dictator is total media control, to avoid being challenged by those different angles of approach. And really, isn't that the very definition of what journalism is supposed to be? It's supposed to challenge ideas, and particularly in a democracy, it's supposed to challenge authority. It doesn't do a lot of good to say, well, they shouldn't do this because they weren't that hard on Obama or something like that. Well, that may be the case. However, maybe the standards need to be raised a bit, and say that news organizations need to more aggressively pursue their mission of acting in the public interest, of questioning authority, challenging authority. Because the only way that authority is legitimized, it should be legitimized in a democracy, is by providing compelling rationales for its actions, rather than acting by fiat in an environment that's exempt from scrutiny.
Yes, I mean, I along with so many people, were so. I was a little terrified, but when the young 30-some-year-old man came out and said that, made that dictatorial type of statement, this is President Trump and his word will not be questioned, and I was like, oh my heavens.
And for the record, that was he's a Duke graduate, and he's not a graduate of UNCG or Guilford
Oh
College.
goodness,
so.
let's bring that North Carolina school rivalry into
Well,
it.
yeah, and there's a part of that is simply a declaration of loyalty, right?
It is,
That
and I think maybe
I'm
he was just
supposed
too young to.
I'm supposed to be an advocate and all of that.
And I don't mean
But-
some of my students get mad when I say too young, but he just said it wrong, maybe.
Well,
I don't.
it's hard to say, really, but I mean,
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It was hard to interpret,
when you
really.
Say, when you say, and you're given many chances to rephrase this,
And he
you're given-
didn't rephrase
You're given
it.
a lot of probing questions, so it's like he's being handed these softballs, right?
Yeah.
And he keeps saying things such as, the president's will should never be questioned.
It was frightening. I have to say, as a mother, I wanted to go, hey, do that again, do over. But like you said, he had many opportunities and he didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's the very definition of the authoritarian dictator, is someone who may not be questioned, who is above all doubt. And the only other thing we need then is that this person has authority from some power higher than any government. And then you have the standard, dictator, whether, throughout history. I'm, as a Holocaust scholar, I'm loath to do specific comparisons and things like that. But I think one of the things to look at is what sorts of discursive techniques are actually inviting further discussion and challenging us to think more deeply. I mean, it's no coincidence when you're engaged in competitive debate, part of the whole process of that is that on the exact same topic, the debaters switch sides from one round to the next. They'll support the resolution one round, the next round
A very
they'll
healthy
oppose
thing
it.
to do. It's an extraordinarily healthy thing
It
to
is.
do.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the best things somebody can do if they're a dogmatic, unconditional believer in, say, one political side, is to do what's known as counter-attitudinal advocacy, and that is to put themselves in a position where they are having to approach things from the other side. By the way, this is also often a very effective way to kind of turn people around who suffer from the disease of deep prejudice, where if they are bigots against a particular group of people, to place them in positions where they would have to look at things from the other side a bit. And often that's far more helpful than just a punitive approach.
It is a very, very healthy approach, and I would encourage anyone to engage in that for everything that you think about politically or partisan, to constantly challenge yourself. Look at the other side.
Absolutely, and that's a great motto in itself.
I found it to be something that helps me, and I'm just as human as anyone else, and we all face this brand new world. It's changing, it's frightening for me at times. It's starting to stable out, thank goodness. But the media debate that's happening is not going to go away. I don't feel like it's going away today. I feel like it needs to be worked out, because it's the statements that have been made. They are statements in which, like you said very well just a moment ago, they could have been retracted at any point. They could have been restated. There are many softballs thrown that could have been taken, so they could have reset it, resaid something again, and not presented it in that way. Now, if we look at it from the say the president's perspective and the new White House's perspective, is there anything we can present from that perspective?
Well, I think from their perspective, part of what they can do is just take a page. I mean, this administration and many Republicans these days, with some justification, are talking about, well, our reference point is taking a look at Ronald Reagan, how successful he was in getting his message across. And one of the things that you saw happening there is that the Reagan White House was very focused on developing a kind of a value-based message that tried to command some type of moral authority and had some basis other than just things are horrible and things are so desperate, just trust me and give me all of the authority and I'll fix everything. That's the classic dictatorial approach. So I mean, I think really if the White House seriously thought about, all right, how am I going to not just construct a clear narrative, what are my values that guide the administration, and even more important, when these values are challenged, and I say when rather than if, when these values are challenged, how can I engage with those divergent voices in ways that can move the discussion forward, rather than having eternal gridlock. I mean, we see what happens in a group setting with Congress when you have a collective body that's just stuck in this us versus them mentality. But it does require some degree of a retreat from dogmatism. And so it's less a matter of saying, what should the White House say and how should they send out the message, than what kind of approach to discourse, to communication, should become manifest. And I think the types of messages that you've been talking about really would be beneficial to all sides. And I would say procedurally, maybe when you reach that impasse, classic conflict, a peace and conflict approach, begin from whatever point you find that's a commonality or a point of convergence, and work outward from that and try to expand that. So it doesn't become this situation of, win, lose, yes, no, red state, blue state, Republican, Democrat. That two-valued orientation fuels the antagonism.
It feels good. It feels good to what I tell my students, to put something in your understand box, your box in your head that, I get that. It's this or it's that, or it's blue. Like you say, it's blue or it's red, or it's yes or it's no. But most things in life are not that. They are gray, they are developing, and it behooves you to constantly step back and think.
Yeah, and again, let me emphasize that because there are so many degrees to things, that doesn't mean there's no truth. And it also doesn't mean truth is whatever we just kind of make up at a moment's notice or whatever it is we like. The issue here is taking a look at better versus worse arguments and supports, and we have to agree on what the evaluative standards are. That's where I get really concerned with the blanket denials of things such as science and math and just the foundations of human knowledge. That is deeply disturbing, because if you don't have that, then you do resort to things such as raw power as the arbiter of disputes.
I agree. That's a whole different topic, that the science and everything in our spiritual. That's an extraordinarily good topic.
Maybe another show later.
Definitely another show. I was thinking though, the one question we're running out of time, but the one question I wanted to ask you today, I'm not sure that we built the conversation on it, but I wanted to ask you whether going forward, we feel, you and I may understand this. We're at least two people who have two different ways of looking at it, or similar ways of looking at it. Maybe many people out there have different ways of looking at it. And the reality that we're experiencing in this debate over media is such that there's a reason, and I guess there's a reason many of us are scared that there is a so-called war going on, and there's folks like InfoWars. We didn't get to that. Alex Jones, just stating that he talks to the president, which is a bit of a frightening thing. He is a person that has a radio station. He has a view that things like not Columbine, but the Sandy Hook massacre was staged, and presenting that as a statement of fact, and whether it's a different thing, we don't have time. But my question was, do you feel the FCC needs to set some different standards as to what is news, what is journalism? Before something goes over the airwaves, it needs to be labeled as a journalistically sound statement versus this is my point of view or my political bias, because I have no problem with a Republican channel on television. I have no problem with a Democratic channel on television. To me, that's just fine. But I don't like it being labeled news one way or the other when it's a mix-up of journalistic presentation versus partisan views.
Well, I mean, what you're mentioning is what Zuckerberg is talking about with Facebook, and it's what Google is talking about is some sort of clear standards. I honestly think that is an effort that is a black hole that would be descended into that you would never escape from.
Really? I mean, do you really think we couldn't set a standard that
I don't
we
think,
take the word news out and we put something else in?
I think once you start down that road, it's highly problematic because you're not going to find a necessary and sufficient set of conditions that always will make something like absolutely true or absolutely false. I actually would take a somewhat different approach, and I'd say rather than trying to regulate the content, what you do is you enhance the critical faculties for assessing the information.
But that's not working. I mean, I don't see that.
Well,
that's supposed to be the way it's done now.
It's supposed to be, but remember, I mean, we don't have a huge amount of history and experience as humanity with this in the kind of media environment we're in. I mean, when you think about it, really, just the presence of social media only became significant as far as elections go to some degree with the 2008 election. But even then, think about it, a lot of social media sites were only a couple of years old then. So really, it's in the last two presidential elections that you've had even that whole part of the media present and playing a role. I'd like to think that through efforts such as what you're doing here, what we do on our day jobs, is helping to equip people with not just a better critical sensibility, but also with the willingness to engage with difference and engage constructively with it. And I think really that is where the greater hope lies. And that grand marketplace of ideas is what ultimately is going to be the arbiter that distinguishes between fake news, real news, stories that have merit, arguments that don't have merit, etc. And so really the issue here is sort of like in the marketplace of products, not just ideas, that ultimately if the consumer gains the power to have a voice and exercises that voice, the products will get better because we won't settle for the products of low quality.
Well, what if they get worse? I mean, if we base it on, I remember publishers telling me just before the recession, I'm sorry, babe, the only thing selling is sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Right.
Love your work, babe,
book,
but it's
right?
not going to sell out there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, has a lot changed since then as far as what's going to sell, what's going to drive that market?
Well, and I think ideally we would have an environment where what sells is also what is quality. So I mean, I think part of it is for us to become more discerning consumers of information, it's always satisfying in the short run, to eat your junk food, to get your junk news and all of that. But in the long run, a more balanced diet, I mean, even beginning with small things, such as expand the repertoire of sources you get your news from, right?
It's an excellent.
Move your radio dial.
Excellent.
Not away from this station,
option.
of course, but have more than one radio station pre-selected, for example, in your car, something
Exactly.
like that.
Yeah.
It's a start.
I think we all consume the tube to some degree,
Mm-hmm.
or read books and read. Or hopefully, people are still reading newspapers. So you may pick up a different one.
And I've heard that there are some of those already. Yeah.
I'm one of them.
Right.
Thank you so much. Anything else you want to add before we're closing up? We have Democracy Now! Coming on here in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I just like to say that the basic theme that you mentioned is one that is an enduring one, and that is constantly seek ways to challenge positions that you hear people take. Don't accept assertions as facts. Constantly seek evidence and constantly evaluate evidence. And remember, that standard applies not only to things that you're exposed to, but to information that you're creating as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy Schwartzman,
Thank you
for
very
coming
much.
on today. Loved
pleasure.
having you. I hope you come back again.
I hope so.
Have a nice evening.
Thanks.
Thank y'all. We're going to go over to some public service announcements.